Welcome to Diamonds and Dumpster Fires, the podcast where faith meets real life and we figure out how to heal when everything's fallen apart. I'm your host, Melie, and I have lived through the mess and got curious about what actually helps us rebuild, from both faith and brain science. Let's untangle the hard stuff together and find some hope in the rubble. Are you ready? Let's go. Hey everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Diamonds in Dumpster Fires. Today we have a very special guest with us, and our episode is The Truth About Joy. It's Not What You Think. And today I'm very excited to welcome Charlie Engelmann to the podcast. Charlie works at Pepperdine University in administration and teaching and is currently finishing up his PhD in joy. So he is the perfect guest to talk to us about joy today. So welcome, Charlie.
Thank you, Melie. It's good to be here.
I always like to start off with a very applicable question to your episode, but what is something bringing you joy right now?
Many things. We're at the final few weeks of our semester at Pepperdine. I've been teaching a class and doing a chapel series that has a lot of joyfulness content. And so one thing that's bringing me joy is just seeing the impact on students and the fruition of many months of them working and me investing in that process and them buying in and just seeing it come to fruition has brought me a lot of joy.
Awesome. So the topic today is the truth about joy. It's not what you think. And so with that, I think a lot of people have misconceptions about joy, and there's a lot of confusion between like what is joy and what is happiness. I know a lot of people use those terms interchangeably, but what is the difference between those and why does it matter?
Yeah, that's a great question. There is a lot of overlap. In particular, they're both positive. They're positive feelings. And because of that, sometimes they're used synonymously. But there's a distinction. And I think the distinction actually has a lot of really interesting and important implications. But if I were to distill down maybe a couple of key differences, one would be if we think about this notion of happiness, especially through, I would say, an American cultural lens. Happiness is oftentimes quite hedonic. It's about pleasure. It's about pursuing things that not only make you feel good, but also help you to not feel bad, right? So happiness is the combination of the existence of positive emotions and the absence of negative emotions. Joy is different. And one of I think the most interesting elements that opens up a whole ton of questions is that joy coexists with negative emotions. So you can be joyful and yet still be grieving, or you can be in the midst of a season where you're struggling with something and yet still have joy. And so joy is distinct from happiness in that it can coexist with negative emotions.
Very interesting. Okay, so yeah, I think that is kind of hard to grasp because we do put those two words together. So it's like, okay, I'm going through some trial right now, so I'm not happy, therefore I don't feel joy. But that's actually what you're saying is it is possible to feel joy even in those moments when you're going through adversity or hard times.
Exactly. Yeah. And this is not anything that is unique to modern social science, although there is a lot of social science these days that is backing up how that's possible, both sort of in the brain and how, you can hold both positive emotions and negative emotions at the same time in the brain. But to go back far further, you can look at a lot of just traditional views on joy. And my tradition is Christianity, and reading throughout the Bible, there are numerous examples of times when people are experiencing both at once. And so maybe one example that I often like to point out is one of those verses that I think oftentimes are overlooked, or it's one of those throwaway verses that I think it's hard to notice until someone points it out. But it's the story of the two Marys visiting the tomb of Jesus after he was crucified and buried. And then, of course, the tomb was empty. They came, they saw it was an empty tomb. And you probably know the story goes, they ran away. But the verse as they left says that as they left, they were afraid and yet filled with joy. And so I kind of have honed in on this. I call it the and yet. Those times where we are feeling things that are not pleasant, and oftentimes in adversity, or we're going through difficult times, or we're experiencing loss, and yet somehow we still are able to experience joy.
That makes total sense. And I never really thought about that part of that story. I've heard it, obviously, because that's my faith too. And so, but yeah, that's really interesting to think about it that they were afraid and yet they also had joy. I love that. Do you think, are there any like popular ideas or, it could just be maybe even just stuff that's shared on social media or things about joy that might actually be harmful or a bit misleading that people kind of gravitate towards?
Yeah, I'd go back to your initial question, which is how it's oftentimes conflated with just happiness. And I think anytime where the pursuit is something where you're trying to avoid negative emotions, you're avoiding something that's uncomfortable, you're avoiding adversity, you're maybe avoiding conflict in relationships, things like that. That oftentimes is, for some people, that's a pathway to feeling good. But in fact, there's momentary pleasure, and obviously that in the moment can feel good, or it can stave off some of the negative emotions that people want to feel. But joy is something that's fostered over time. And not only, as I said, it does coexist with negative emotions, but in fact, I think you need adversity. You need challenging experiences to hone the very processes that result in joy. And so, in many ways, you can say that those challenging or negative things are necessary elements to a joyful person.
Interesting. Yeah, and you would think that would be the opposite. Like you would think the person who had no adversity, no discomfort in their life would be the most joyful. And yet it's the people who, time and again, you hear these stories of people who really came through the fire and found true joy after that kind of an experience.
Yeah, and I can kind of delve into that a little bit of how that works without getting maybe too geeky on it all. But there's a couple of elements to that. One is, so when we think about joyfulness, I often talk about it. There's three elements. There's the three A's. There's affect, appraisals, and actions. So there's the way we feel, which is affect. There's the way we think, which is our appraisal mechanisms, and then there are actions, which are our behaviors. That second one, the appraisals, is how we sort of view the world. It's the lens through which we interpret our circumstances, how we interact with people, how we make sense of things. It's our, the mechanism of attribution, right? And for a joyful person, if you're never confronted with, I'm sorry, for any people, not necessarily joyful, for any people, if you're not confronted with adversity or challenging situations, then essentially that appraisal mechanism or that way of making sense of the world atrophies. So it's just a muscle that's not exercised, and it's only through the times where we go through difficult things or we have to engage in uncomfortable situations, but then also in intentional ways foster that way of making sense of things in a meaningful way. That is how joy is fostered and becomes very durable over time. So that's one way. Another way that this is recently I've been and I know you have as well, been nerding out on neuroscience, and there's so many great books out there. So a book I read a few months ago is called Dopamine Nation. It's by Anna Lembke. She's a psychiatrist at Stanford. She wrote this book about our brain, and one of the big takeaways in the book is that our pain and pleasure centers are co-located in the brain, and she says it acts as a sort of seesaw. So the more that we have exogenous stimulation of our pleasure centers, meaning things we do that provide quick dopamine hits, like scrolling social media, eating sugary food, binging Netflix, anything that's like a quick dopamine spike, those things sort of press down on the pleasure side of that seesaw, if you can imagine that.
Mm-hmm.
And then she says your brain, and she uses these terms, your brain has these pain gremlins. So they try to maintain homeostasis. So they try to maintain a balance. And so they actually downregulate the endogenous or the sort of naturally induced dopamine that our brains always produce. And so we actually, by doing these quick dopamine hits, they sort of press down the side where we're doing it ourselves, and then we become reliant on those things. And when we don't have them, so we don't have the sugar, we don't have the Instagram feed or whatever, then we actually are literally we are less happy. We have less baseline dopamine. But the opposite is true as well. So the more we do things that are, especially slightly painful, I wouldn't say like ridiculous, but everything from exercise is painful and provides discomfort, or sitting still and being quiet is uncomfortable. Doing like going out and doing something socially that might feel uncomfortable at first. All those things, they press down on the pain side, and then your brain sort of endogenously starts pressing down on the pleasure side. And then as you go past that difficult experience, then you actually have a higher baseline level of dopamine. And dopamine is one of the many ways that we feel pleasure, but it's an example of how when we do things that are difficult, be it exercise, ice plunges, having healthy routines that maybe don't feel good in the moment, but over time they actually make our brains just feel better. And that's a part of joy. It's one element of joy, but it's an important component that, again, as we pursue things as a culture or as a society, if we pursue things that are only comfortable, the result is, ironically, we become less happy.
That's really interesting. It makes total sense too. I'm just thinking of times where, like, maybe, I was not feeling necessarily joyful, and then I decided to, do weightlifting, lifted heavy, totally, just worked out hard, and then that was obviously really hard, and I'm tired, but then I feel joy. I've never done the ice plunge thing, though. I don't think I would try that. That's a little too adverse for me, I think.
I'm not there either. I know it's there in theory, but I'm also not there. And also, I know I've been talking theory. There's been, honestly, many times in my life that I've intentionally pursued discomfort, and times I've conscious of the fact that I'm living in places of immense comfort, and I've really tried to understand myself in those situations and how joyful I am. And I do think comfortable times sort of lead to a sort of spiritual and fundamental complacency that is manifested through emotions. So, and I think joy is connected to a very deep part of who we are. And so if we're complacent at a spiritual level, I think that does affect our sense of joy. And conversely, times where I've been in environments where I'm regularly challenged, or I'm in routines where I'm pushing myself outside of my comfort zone, I just feel alive. And it's that complacency, or whatever it is. It's not, it's very different from happiness, but it's a deeper level of something that's quite fulfilling. And I think as we're conscious of that, we do end up wanting to pursue it, even if it's not the immediate gratification type of thing.
Yeah, that definitely makes a lot of sense. And I know you mentioned how, like, scrolling through social media can kind of hit that dopamine center. How do you think, obviously our culture today, especially with social media, everything's kind of this like fake version of joy, I would say. Everyone's putting their best foot forward and showing only the shiny side of things, on social media. How do you think that kind of culture actually warps our understanding of joy?
Yeah, social media, which I'm on, full disclosure. At least I'm on Instagram. I'm on a million things. That is a tricky thing, because there's elements of it that are consistent with joy, and specifically, for me, being on Facebook or Instagram helps me connect with people whom I otherwise may not connect with very well, and share highlights of my life. So there are people, I've lived all over the world, and I have friends scattered literally across all continents. And so for me to have social media has really been a blessing to stay connected with those people. And it's a level of connection. It's obviously not super deep, but it's a continuation of those relationships. So that's good. What is not good is when it's curated, or when it creates a sense of social comparison. So if I'm scrolling through and I'm seeing other people's lives, then that may make me feel like my life is less than, and that's a component of sometimes, or a barrier to what makes people feel joyful. So it's a double edged sword. I do think that I'm a proponent of moderation in pretty much everything. So I think there's a moderation rule that's important in that, but also maybe at a deeper level, just a very healthy awareness of your own state. And so as you're engaging in social media, how does it make you feel? And if it doesn't make you feel good, get off of it or take a break from it. But if it's not necessarily affecting you in negative ways, then quite the opposite. If it's helping you connect with people and makes you feel better, then of course that's something you can lean into.
Yeah, definitely. I do think also, obviously it's a little bit different, but things like the dating apps can also create that same sort of mentality for people where they're like, swiping away and getting that dopamine hit from just, swipe, swipe, swipe on people's faces. For me, the dating apps would fall in the category of adversity and discomfort rather than the joy, but I know it goes differently for different people. But like, what would you say, like, how can somebody who's realizing, like, hey, you know what, I'm getting this sort of fake version of joy, this dopamine hit from just doing these things, like,
Mm.
what would be a good step they could take to try to actually move themselves into more of like a real joyful life?
Yeah. And so this is definitely true for joy, but it's frankly true for so many elements of positive mental health and whatever, words you want to describe for that. And that is having genuine connection, real relationships. And so all of these things, so be it the dating apps or social media, but anything online, none of that's truly connection.
Mhm.
So if they're ever sort of treated as a replacement for connection, then those are ingredients for negative mental health. But yeah, there's so much research that, including as I think about joyfulness, part of being joyful is being part of, not just being part of, being a contributing member to a community. So it's not just that you show up to things or you have friends, but you're investing in community. You feel like you're a part of a community in a way that is a value add. So this is and Paul talks about in Second Corinthians being a member of a body, right? And how important it is to have both a hand and a foot. You can't, they're different, but they need each other, kind of thing. And that's part of, I think, what it means to have a joyful lifestyle, is being a contributing, vital member of a community. So these apps or these social media platforms, at their worst, are sometimes treated as replacements for real life interaction, or even if you're with people in real life and yet you're staring at a phone,
Yeah.
because then that also detracts from a meaningful relationship. So I'd say that would be the main thing, is just making sure if they're a part of your life, they're not detracting from the things that really matter, which are actual human in-person relationships.
Totally. Yes, and I think we've all been guilty of pulling out our phones at the dinner table and, like, mindlessly scrolling social media. I do have an example where I was actually with somebody in real life that I had met on a dating app. We were spending time together, and he was pulled away from the connection by all of the dating app notifications he was getting. So, needless to say, that didn't work out very well.
That's what they call a red flag in the dating world.
Absolutely.
I would say, so another book, if I'm going to make book recommendations, is one I recently read called The Dose Effect, which is another neuroscience book. And the dose acronym is for dopamine, oxytocin, serotonin, and endorphins. So it's kind of like the pleasure chemicals in your brain. But a huge, huge, huge takeaway from that book, and that's what's really emphasized, is having very, very healthy boundaries with your phone and all of the things that your phone represents. Everything from like making sure, turn off, don't have notifications, period. Keep your phone away from you. Have strict times during the day when maybe you allow yourself to check social media, all those types of things. And so since I've read that book, I've done my best to implement some of the things that are talked about. But for example, when I wake up in the morning, I don't let myself look at my phone for the first hour. So my first hour is spent, journaling, walking my dog outside, just things like that, where the initial, whatever is causing me the initial pleasure in the day, be it dopamine or whatever, it doesn't come from my phone. And then what happens, they say, is whatever causes you pleasure in the beginning of the day, you end up craving for the rest of the day. And so you have to be very careful and intentional about that first, 1 or 2 hours.
That is such a good point. I do love that you mentioned journaling. That's something I'm really passionate about. I keep a gratitude journal that I do write in. I guess I should say, I always say, oh, it's the first thing I do. It's probably really the second thing I do because I do look at the phone, but I'm going to work on that. But I saw recently you posted a picture on Instagram of you with, like, was it 150 journals that you had written in?
Yes.
That was
Yes.
amazing.
And it's connected to my joy journey a little bit. So this is like my fun fact. Oftentimes when we're meeting new people and they go around the circle and I have to share some sort of fun fact, this is my go-to, which is that I have journaled every day now for almost 30 years. And I've literally
Wow.
not missed a day. And so obviously I've gone through a lot of journals. And so the other day, the post I had was I was starting my 150th actual physical journal. And so it does connect to my journey of understanding joy, because so I started this a long time ago. People can start doing the math, but I was 17 years old, and on my very first day of journaling, I decided, I don't even know why, but I decided to give myself a joy score. So like 1 to 10, how joyful do I feel today? And the next day I did it again, and then the next day I did it again and again and again. And I've done that every day now for almost 30 years. And so probably, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago, so my master's is in economics. So there's a little part of me that loves data and graphs and things like that. And I was like, gosh, I have all this data on myself. And so I literally plugged it all into a spreadsheet, and I started like thinking about what are the seasons in my life that have been joyful? What are the seasons that I haven't felt joyful? And I've sort of tried to think about that, and what are the elements that I can understand to better foster joyfulness. And that's partly what led eventually to my PhD focuses. I had already had all these learnings of, the guinea pig, which is myself, and wanted to see how that might be consistent with the social science. So journaling is a big part of my life. I use it to try to, like you said, like gratitude is a big part of it, focus on and savor good things. I also use it to process my emotions and allowing myself to feel what I feel, but not just let it sit there, but really try to make sense of it in a way that connects to my sort of broader narratives about life, so that even when I'm going through difficult things, there's meaning attached to them as well.
Wow, that's truly amazing. Yeah, I loved that photo too with all the actual journals. I think a lot of people, have gotten away from pen and paper. You can journal on your phone, of course, but there's just something about like having like an actual cool journal that you're excited about, aesthetically and everything, and then being able to write in it and seeing all the different ones you had was just super cool.
Thank you.
So now let's talk a little bit about this thing that you had mentioned when we did our pre-call about like the paradox of pursuing joy. Can you explain that concept a little bit?
Yeah, and this goes again. This is an idea that I think I was first aware of through just reading the Bible and my Christian lens. But it comes from the Beatitudes in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew. And if you read, the Beatitudes are the, blessed are, blessed are, blessed are series where Jesus talks about what makes someone blessed. But the translation for blessed is a word makarios, which can be translated as joy. Sometimes I've seen it translated as happy, but it's one of those like really deep words that it's probably more about flourishing and thriving. So, but if you read them, you see, blessed are the poor in spirit, blessed are the merciful, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. So all these things that, as I said earlier, these are not like positive emotion things, right? These are things that actually sound kind of negative. And the one thing you don't see is blessed are those who pursue blessings, or blessed are those who pursue happiness. And so one of the big takeaways is that I think from my Christian worldview is that happiness is a good thing. God is not anti-happiness, but it's a byproduct. It's not the pursuit. It's not the ultimate goal. Happiness and joy, they come as a result of pursuing things that are transcendent and that are bigger than merely feeling good. And so going back to this joyful construct, or this idea of joyfulness, it's something that I think is a result of our connection to transcendent things and God. And, for me, my connection to God is one of those things. But I also think, transcendence can be found as we do give ourselves to broader causes, to communities, as we consider our broader narratives and the stories that we embed ourselves in. That can be meaningful, and that can be also joy-giving. But if we are merely looking, sort of navel-gazing at ourselves and not seeing the bigger picture that we're a part of, then that actually detracts from our sense of joy.
Interesting. So yeah, it's like the more we think I'm going to actually pursue joy for the sake of joy is actually we will maybe find it less, as opposed to pursuing things like you said, like community and doing, good things for others and finding joy in those types of circumstances, it sounds like.
Yeah, absolutely. And this again goes back, this is where I love sometimes when I get into the social science and sometimes even neuroscience of it all. It's consistent, and people who pursue pleasure for pleasure's end are actually deeply unhappy people. And we see this, individually, but we also see this society wide. Like if you look at the US, we are literally the most comfortable and affluent civilization in the history of humanity. And I'll use the term, and yet we have rising negative mental health trends. We have,
Right.
Depression, loneliness, all these things that people don't like. So it's clear that material comfort, immediate pleasure comfort are not the things that bring joy, but we're sort of taught in our culture to pursue those things. But it's really pursuing things that are beyond that sometimes even don't feel good in the moment, but as we pursue those greater goods and those greater ideals, we're blessed to be joyful because of it.
So would you say that joy is something that like someone can actually choose, or is it something that more sneaks up on you when you least expect it?
So I don't want to get too jargony, but it's durable but malleable. Okay, durable but malleable, meaning joy is something that the malleable part means it can be developed. You can invest, you can change your habits, you can work on your ways of thinking and your appraisal mechanisms. You can exercise and sleep. Well, all these things can actually help you to become more joyful. But a lot of these things are not, there's no shortcuts really. There's no hacks for them. They take effort. They are sometimes uncomfortable. They take time. But the good thing is once they're there, they're durable, meaning they last. And so that's why joy, again, contrasting it to happiness is more fleeting, like I had a happy day, or gosh, I went to the beach and it was sunny and I felt really good and I got home and I was like, back to normal. But joyfulness is something, because it's connected to things that are transcendent, it's not dependent on our immediate circumstances. So it's durable. And so, yes, it can be developed. I wouldn't say it sneaks up on you. There's another way of thinking of joy. You have joyful moments, sure. But to be joyful in the way I think of it or conceptualize it is something that's more enduring.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, I know another thing that we had talked about was kind of that interconnection of like behaviors, thoughts, and feelings. So I'd love to spend some time talking about that relationship of kind of how we act, how we think, and how we feel, and how those three areas play into this cultivation of joy.
Yeah. And so another question is one upstream to another, meaning is there an antecedent to, like, if you can change how you think, will that affect how you feel? Or do you change your behaviors and that'll affect how you think, which will affect but what we found is that those three elements are symbiotic, meaning they're multi-directional, so they affect each other. And what's good about that is if you wanted to have some sort of intervention, if you wanted to change your life and try to become more joyful, you can start in many ways. You can start with trying to hone how you think. So you mentioned gratitude journaling. That's probably one of the, like, in terms of research, probably the most effective way to change from a pessimistic way of viewing the world to a more optimistic way of viewing the world. So you can change your appraisal mechanisms, right? It's how you think. Or, there's habits, and sometimes it's like, it's hard to start new habits. Well, maybe start with one thing. Start going to bed on time and trying to get a proper night of sleep, right? Or join a gym class or something, get involved and try to commit. And as you start getting committed to one thing on the behavior side, that oftentimes leads to other positive behaviors. So this is the virtuous cycle sometimes they talk about. And then there's the feeling side, and so can you just directly affect your feelings? The answer is yes, actually you can. I mean, being around good people, watching funny things, laughing, but really a lot of the affect part is about being conscious of those four main chemicals that I had talked about before, the dose effect, but just really trying to do things that are good for the chemicals in your brain that are associated with feeling good, right? So doing things that foster good dopamine, not quick hit dopamine, fostering serotonin, fostering endorphins. And again, like, none of those things happen in a vacuum. They are very much connected to how we think, how we behave. And the more you start prioritizing one, naturally the others go with them. But it doesn't have to be sequential. It can honestly be in any way.
Interesting. I do notice, like, just, as I do the gratitude journaling, I started that practice. I should have started it years and years ago, but I actually started it as I was going through my divorce, which seems like a time when you wouldn't necessarily be like super grateful, right? But that's why I did it. I wanted to cultivate that. And so I forced myself. And sometimes I really had to find, like, I was, going through it. I was so just upset and distraught. And yet I'd be like, I'm thankful for a good cup of coffee in the morning. Like, that's a great thing, right? And it was something I was grateful for. It was like, maybe that was the only thing I could write down, but it was kind of by, cultivating that. And each morning it got easier and easier to think of more and more things. I'm like, well, I have a family that loves me. I've got, a community a new community for me, but still I'm getting involved in, like, you kind of, it almost like just opens up the doorway to like seeing more of that. So, and I would assume that's how it is with all these other things that we can do. If you join the gym class, at first you might not love it, but eventually, right?
Mm, yeah. Yeah.
That's
And I would
interesting.
say on the gratitude journaling there, it's just effective. I don't think it's has to be super complicated to explain why it's effective. It's like, yeah, if you focus on things that you're grateful for, you'll probably feel better. But actually, it is incredible to see how that works. So there's the axiom for your brain and your neural pathways that what fires together wires together. Meaning, if you're focusing on something, your neural pathways start firing in a direction that create these neural pathways, and they start getting hardened, and they get and you literally just become by gratitude journaling, you're teaching your brain to scan for gratitude or things to be grateful for throughout the day. And so, yes, that's a good thing, and we need more of it in the world, individually and collectively, right? So there's that. And I was going to say too, I went through my own divorce a few years ago, and it was if I go back to my seasons of joy, it was the worst, most difficult season of my life. It was the absolute low point in my life, and was so hard to get through. And one of the things, and there's many things during that time that really helped me to endure, but one of the things was that was the first time I started exercising every day, and I previously had never done it. And I joined a gym class, and they had like these sessions that if you didn't show up, they would charge you extra money. And,
Wow.
so there's like this incentive. So I was like, okay, I got to go. So some days I didn't feel like going, but I went. But then it became communal, which is good. And I made friends. But there was something about I had so much going on in my life during that time that was stressful, and my body just felt like it was filled with the stress hormone cortisol. So I just felt all this cortisol in my life, and I would go and I'd have this just crazy rigorous 1 hour workout, and at the end I just felt like all the cortisol was flushed away, felt endorphins. And I think it's a healthy addiction, but I became addicted. It was just so good. And so that's one way where that led to a lot of other things that I think helped me not just avoid the discomfort of going through that divorce process, but it was a way to sort of process it physically through my actions that allowed me to also deal with things in many other ways, so that I could, that I can get through that really difficult time.
Wow. Now, I know a lot of listeners to this podcast are either in the middle of a divorce or have gone through divorce or some other kind of traumatic situation. And I know that earlier we did talk about, the big role that community does play in building joy. But a lot of times when you're going through something like that, a lot of people do feel isolated. So, can you experience deep joy in moments of isolation?
Oh, that's a tough question. I mean, I think in theory, yes. I think it's really hard to. I think community is really important, and at the same time, I don't want people who feel isolated to feel guilty about their isolation. So similar to you, as I was going through my divorce, so I lived in China for 15 years, and it was during COVID that the divorce was happening, and my work situation ended there during COVID, and so not only was I going through a divorce, but I had to not only move but move internationally
Wow.
and start over, in the US. And it was, so there was a lot of really difficult things I was processing. And then I would add another layer to that, which is my main community was my Christian community. I had friends outside the church, of course, but my main closest friends were within the church. And one of the biggest things I struggled with, especially in the beginning, was shame. And I wanted to hide from that community because I felt like either I would be judged or that, people wouldn't understand. And I will say, people have different experiences with their church communities. My community was incredible. They were so full of grace, so supportive during that time. But I think I sort of projected onto them the reactions that I would have had I had a friend going through a divorce, and I think it exposed in me some of the judgment I had in my heart towards others. But all that being said, it was, for many reasons, it was a difficult time for me socially and in terms of my community. And I had friends they would like text me when I was back in the US, like, do you have community? So they knew, right? And so I tried to be intentional with that. It's awkward. It's awkward at a certain age, to like make friends again.
It
It's
is.
awkward.
It is
It's
so
so
hard.
awkward, and I'm not going to pretend like it was like easy for me. It helped that I had some continuity with my work community and things like that, but it was hard. But all that being said, it's one just to like normalize. It's hard and awkward, and sometimes it feels like you feel shame. But at the same time, I don't want to minimize the fact that community is incredibly important.
Yeah, very much so. I completely agree. Yeah, I just going back to what you said about how hard it is to make friends, like when I'm in my 40s and I am trying to meet people. So you go to things and, you join different groups. So it kind of goes back to that adversity and discomfort, right? Because
Hmm.
there's something so much different about going to like a home fellowship with people you've known for years and showing up at like, the church singles mixer
Yeah,
as the new girl. And I gotta say, like, I think I'm
yeah,
done with those types of events, but I mean, it's like it takes a lot out of you, right, to like go and do that. But there's a benefit to it, even if it turns out to be a total train wreck. You are building that muscle, right, that adversity muscle.
it is. It is, and I don't know if this is the right way to say it, but it's kind of a numbers game. Like eventually you find people you connect with. So I like I
Right.
was thinking like my first year back, like I joined a kickball league, but I felt like I was like double the age of everyone. And I was like, and people, I just felt like they were like, who's this old dude play? There was so many times that I was like, what am I doing? But yeah, there's an element of like eventually you start making connections, and the worst thing you can do is hole up at home and not be around humans. So even I think with like the awkward interaction, there's some value there. It's humanizing to be around humans, right?
Totally.
But when we sit at home alone and or just have these virtual connections through social media or whatever, it's not the same. And those ultimately over time, I think, really deteriorate us at a very fundamental, in a very like central way to who we are.
I totally agree. And for anyone listening who is kind of in that place where you are maybe feeling like what Charlie had mentioned about, that shame and not wanting to share that story, I was totally there as well, especially like trying to tell new people at a church. And I, was getting involved in ministry and worship leading. And yet I felt like I had to like, put like a scarlet letter around my neck, say, well, by
Mm-mm.
the way, before you bring me in to do this, you should know I'm divorced. And it just felt horrible to me, and nobody treated me that way. That was just all in my own head doing that. But I will say, when you do step out, like I recently went to an event. I knew like 2 people there, but I felt really uncomfortable. It was this big, event, and ended up at a table. There was a woman there who felt really compelled to just pray for me, and the prayer that she said for me was so beautiful and exactly spoke to like what was going on in my life, that I'm like, "You know what? This is why we do this." If you are a part of a faith and you are in a community, reach out. Don't be afraid to just, put yourself out there. And it does feel awkward, but people will come around you. The right people will find you at these events. If you're more introverted, you don't like to, go to big events, just find one person to talk to. That's what I always try to encourage people to do, because I lean that way a little bit. I'm an ambivert. I love that term has become super popular, but it's like half extrovert, half introvert. But get me in a room of like 200 people I don't know, and I'll just like stand in the back alone like the whole time.
Mm.
But yeah, I'd love to know, like, for that person who is listening, who is in this moment of joylessness, they feel like, everything, they are literally living the dumpster fire right now. What would be like your kind of top advice that you would give them?
That's a great question because I think it goes to almost the question is difficult because I don't think that there's an immediate fix to anything that it truly leads to joy. I think it's the intentional and gradual investment in the things that are meaningful. And I hope that doesn't sound like discouraging in some ways if someone's feeling that way, but but I think it's important to note, like, so some of it is like start identifying the areas of their life that they know might be incompatible with joy. So it might be the addiction to the phone. It might be dietary. It might be goodness, like I barely sleep well, and I go to sleep super late every night, and lack of exercise. It might be I've kind of shut out my community. It could be so many things, and not necessarily doing everything at once, because as I said, I think the nature of those three elements of joy they can all be entry points to intervention that creates what's known in social science as the virtuous cycle. So it's this upward spiral where once you start doing one thing that's good, it actually starts leading to another thing. And then you lean into that, and that leads into another thing. So if you start, for example, like with me, with exercising, that exercising helped me be a little bit more disciplined with my eating habits. And then as I had better eating habits, maybe that helped me to be a little bit more, I felt more courage to confront some of the negative emotions I was feeling. And so I could process those as I journaled, and so on and so forth. And so one step at a time. So I would just say it could be anything, but it's also not just one thing. And whatever it is, just knowing that it's not necessarily going to feel better right away. It's something that just has to happen over time.
Definitely. And it's like in that principle in like coaching of like 1% increments. Like don't think about trying to make this huge change. Like, for example, if you are somebody who doesn't exercise, maybe don't commit to, 5 days of heavy weightlifting every week. Like maybe just go to the gym for 30 minutes and do something, right? And and
Yeah.
incrementally you start to build that muscle.
Yeah. And if you want to, I think you link to things. The book I just recently read, The Dose Effect, the author's name is TJ Power. The book isn't like, it's a good book, but it's a pretty easy read. And every section has 5 practical things you can do that will help with that particular, chemical in your brain. So 5 things to help with dopamine, 5 things to help with oxytocin. And as I was reading that, I'm like, all of this is so consistent with a joyful lifestyle. So I would say if you want to just like a book to read that's not too hard and has some practical things, the DOSE, the Dose Effect, is a good one.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And I will have a link to that in the show notes for anybody listening that would like to check that out. Well, thank you so much, Charlie. This has been such a great conversation. I feel like, I could ask you a million more questions about joy. Thank you for being part of the podcast today. And I know that listeners are going to get so much out of this. Just really appreciate you doing this today.
Thank you, Melie. I really appreciate the conversation as well.
That's a wrap on this episode of Diamonds and Dumpster Fires. If you're walking through the ashes right now, remember, you're not broken. You are becoming. Don't forget to subscribe, share with a friend who needs it, and come back next week for more faith, honesty, and a whole lot of heart. See you next time.